law. Are you going to be speaking through that mic or this one? You can on both. Yeah. Because you need to speak into that so that everyone can hear you.
Okay.
So, I don't know if you... Yeah.
Sorry. Good morning.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Mind the Culture Gap, Understanding and Appreciating the Role of Culture in Developing Effective Interventions for IPV. This is a seminar that is the sixth in a series, which has been funded by the Economic Social Research Council. It's an interdisciplinary research team that has been leading this research project, looking at the interconnections between substance abuse and intimate partner violence. The seminars so far have taken place in London, New York, Rochester, Glasgow, Melbourne, and Hong Kong marks the sixth and final leg. So today we're looking at culture in a broader sense, looking at the effectiveness of frameworks and institutional capacities to provide meaningful interventions to victims and perpetrators caught in a situation of intimate partner violence, because we now recognize that their response systems vary based on the factors that are influencing their existing situations, and that these factors will impact their receptivity to the programs that are currently in place in order to address their specific needs. And essentially, the findings from various research studies are starting to show that the failure to account for, understand, and consider the role of these additional factors and external conflict in their value systems, their identities, and their position in society will invariably affect how well we're able to assist people finding themselves in situations of violence. So this creates a critical service gap. So we hope that the seminar brings to you a more diverse set of ideas to help you rethink what areas we need to be working on and reconsidering in developing appropriate tools and strategies for intervention in this context. So first of all, I'd like to extend a very, very warm welcome to both our overseas speakers, Elizabeth and Polly, and also to my colleagues from Social Work Department, Anna and Edward, who'll be speaking to us today. First up, we have Dr. Elizabeth Gilchrist, who is a professor and a registered forensic psychologist in the School of Health and Life Sciences at Glasgow Caledonian University. Her primary research interest is in the area of domestic violence with a particular focus on risk assessment. She's been involved in training postgraduate forensic psychologists since 1996 and is a member of various forensic and professional committees within the British Psychological Society. She's also widely recognized as an expert in the area of child protection and domestic violence and as a member of the Scottish Centre for Crime and Justice Research. And most importantly, she wears various hats, including sitting as chair currently of the Parole Board in Scotland. And so she's got access to perpetrators and victims and has a very, very sound and strong understanding of what some of the areas we need to be looking into are and what kind of tools we need to be equipped with to do our work better. She'll be speaking to us this morning about culture and IPV, discussing 3 studies into the roles of alcohol, parenting, and culture in families experiencing IPV. Let's welcome Professor Gilchrist.
I'm just hoping we'll get... Brilliant. Well, good morning, and I'm delighted to be here. I've got to say that the seminar series we've been involved in has been absolutely fascinating and incredibly helpful in terms of developing links, ideas, and refining theory. I have quite an ambitious task in some ways in terms of I want to touch on 3 studies that I've been involved in directing through the university in Glasgow, but also to make a few points in terms of practitioner implications, because one of the things I think, as Pooja has said, is that I'm an academic, but I'm also a practitioner, and I have a sort of a duty, I think, to try and translate some of the academic information for practice in terms of implications for how we structure services and how we work within services. So one of the first things, just a really quick definition I wanted to put up, is this is one of the United Nations definitions of domestic violence, which is clearly highlighting the gender base and gender equality, and looking at structural issues as well as individual definitions. So I'd like to emphasise that for me it's really important to move away from seeing domestic violence as being an issue of psychopathology within an individual, and so to then reconceptualise it at a number of different levels. So within family systems, within cultures, within social structures, and within wide cultural understandings of the roles of men and women, families, fathers, mothers and children. And I actually think it's beyond culture in the sense of our ethnic identities or our nationalities. It's a culture in a far broader sense. So I'm going to problematise Scottish mainstream culture as well as other cultures. And hopefully by the end of it, you'll maybe understand with me why I think we need to really think this way, because it has very important implications for interventions and where we locate those interventions and how we link them. So in terms of Scotland, we do have high rates of intimate partner violence. Our population is around about 5.5 million, so less than a Hong Kong population. But we have good reporting. We have a police force that prioritise domestic abuse as one of the really high focus. And the reason they'd done that was because they had identified that it was the area they were doing a lot of work on and making no difference. We've challenged some of our gang-related violence, our young people's violence. We've made a difference. We continue to have this high level, 60,000 plus incidents per year of domestic abuse within a small population, and that is the ones recorded by the police. What we also have is that it is gendered in Scotland. We have a gendered definition in Scotland. 80% of the incidents are reported perpetrated by males on females. And of the other 20, it's not necessarily, I know we're going to talk about male victims later, but indeed it's not necessarily that we have male victims and perpetrated by females. We have a lot of male on male violence and female on female violence, which I think is an area that has been even less explored. We also, I think we know that there's a co-occurrence of abuses in terms of domestic abuse, so adult to adult and adult to child violence. In Scotland, at the minimum, the lowest level of estimation is that 38% of the incidents, there are children present. So children present in the house and aware of the incidents going on. We have a really high link with alcohol in our recorded incidents. And in fact, if we go to our prison populations, even higher. So almost 60% of cases, people were intoxicated. And most often that was the perpetrator. About a third of the time it was perpetrator and victim. Very rarely was it the victim only. And there were some interesting interplays between when the children were present and the victim was drunk, in the sense that mothers tended not to have been drinking if their children were present. So there were some interesting stories to be told, because implicit within some of our practice is that some people think that it's difficult families, it's chaotic families, it's substance misuse. There's a drunken mother who's failing to protect her child, and they're all drinking together. And that's not the story within the pictures of the incidents that we were seeing, that actually mum was remaining sober to protect the child whilst dad was coming home drunk. So some interesting things that we really need to challenge. In terms of minority ethnic groups, and this is by ethnicity rather than anything else, looking at the Scottish Government, 2009, the Scottish Government said that there was very little information as to the experiences of minority ethnic women. And this is in a society where we have a duty to record, and we record in every walk of life issues to do with our identities, to do with gender, to do with equalities. We have strong laws in terms of equalities, and yet somehow or other we don't know about the experiences of minority ethnic women, and even less about minority ethnic men. The only thing that they note, and if I could draw your attention to this, is that they do know that from the work that has been undertaken, there are special issues and complexities when you end up with multiple identities. So going forward, we also know that traditional interventions don't tend to work. We have 20 to 30% recidivism within 6 months of perpetrators going through traditional groups. We know that there's a high comorbidity of substance misuse, other issues, child abuse, And we do know that these multiple social identities, and particularly deprived identities, so excluded or marginalised identities, make things worse. So we need to consider multiple identities and multiple levels. This is my favourite model. I've become a big fan of the nested ecological model or the bioecological model or socio-ecological model of many, many areas. So in terms of, I don't know if it's a model you're familiar with, the idea that you have multiple layers that affect development of an individual, they affect people's interactions within society, they affect how we conceptualise our problems, they affect how we structure our interventions. So at the very heart, you have an individual who has their own personality, age, sex, gender, etc. Health needs, strengths, resilience, coping strategies. Next to that, there's a microsystem of influences in terms of the immediate social environment of peers, friends, school, and family. Religious communities, though, also important, neighbourhood and things like that. You then have an ecosystem of economic structures, of government, of local structures, and perhaps subcultural values, so that within the UK society, certainly we have majority cultures, we have minority cultures, and we have different structures and different access to structures depending on where you sit within that. And then at the macro system level, if we came back to sort of maybe a patriarchal explanation, the sort of cultural values in terms of big concepts about gender, about ethnicity, are huge in terms of how we understand ourselves and how culturally, we have cultural norms that we accept. They generally are the majority cultural norms, and they are influential in law, in access to social justice, in health, and even how we understand ourselves. So the idea of a person as a system with a number of different features and a number of different aspects at different levels that impinge on them, developmentally, but also access to services, is really important to me. So in terms of also what we know, this is me as a psychologist talking, we know that strengths-based interventions work better because people engage with them better when their values are listened to and met, where the intervention accords with our value system, and where things are delivered in such a way that it can be accessed. And that could be levels of intellectual ability, it could be cultural values, it could be learning styles, so visual learner, auditory learner, etc. One size does not fit all. We can't give programmatic interventions to a group of people who have, on average, certain needs, because pretty much nobody in the room would be the average person. So we generally bland out what would make it meaningful to the groups, the people in the room. We also know that the interventions have to be targeted. So we need to understand our populations. So we need to focus on some of the deficits, some of the risks and needs, but do it in such a way that we're focusing also on the strengths that people bring and fostering things like resilience. The facilitators need to be good, they need to be trained, they need to understand the group that they're working with so that they can deliver in a responsive manner. And one of the things coming out of counselling psychology is one of the biggest influences on how effective an intervention is the Therapeutic Alliance between the person delivering the programme and the individuals in the room. Now, if you think about cultural barriers, language barriers, difference and a lack of or a misunderstanding of those differences, you can understand that we, without good understandings from our data and that translated into training, we will get nowhere because we're talking at different languages. We could be talking past one another rather than to one another. It needs to be delivered in a culturally sensitive way, in an appropriate way, and that's not just about what we would talk about being politically correct. It's about making things effective. So what do we know about domestic abuse? I'm briefly going to touch on these 3 studies and give you little snapshots of some of what people have said about them. And hopefully at the end, you'll come back to being able to see why the interventions need to be focused in a particular way and some of the key things that we do need to address. So we know heavy drinkers are more likely to be involved in violence. So people who have heavy drugs usage, heavy substance use, not necessarily an addictions model though. And I would highlight that it doesn't necessarily have to be a medical addictions model. Alcohol is often present as a risk factor in terms of a risk factor. This is when it's going to occur, when somebody is intoxicated, rather than a chronic risk factor. So it's a dynamic risk factor in terms of when the violence may occur and how severe the violence might be, but not necessarily that it is going to happen. So this is why I'm talking about there is a direct effect of alcohol in terms of intoxication, indirect effects in terms of present, emotionally present, other stressors, focusing on accessing substances rather than family life. And a spurious effect, maybe it's present in people who struggle to cope. So maybe anger, pro-coping, avoidant coping, and drinking coexist. But there's also a multiple thresholds model, which I think is very useful. So for some people, for them to be abusive within their relationship, for them to be violent, then alcohol has to be present. In fact, it may mean that they have to be intoxicated. For others, then the violence is likely to occur. So people who are higher perhaps on antisocial personality, people who have other beliefs about entitlement, narcissism, etc.,